My name is Theresa Carter, 40 years old. The base woke the way it always did. Fluorescents humming, flag cracking in the chill breeze, coffee drifting down the corridor outside the command suite like a standing order. Be alert, be steady, be the wall that doesn't move. Routine is a kind of armor in this place. Badge scan, morning brief, personnel updates, inspection rounds. My reflection in the tempered glass looked like it belonged to the building. Straight lines, regulation edges, everything in its place. An entry on the visitor schedule snagged my eye. Retired General Marcus J. Hayden, Hall of Honor, ceremonial signing of the command logbook. Tradition. A handshake, a photograph, a signature on blue leather, older than most of our lieutenants. Nothing classified. Nothing to sweat. Yet when I read his name, a small wire twanged inside my chest. Hayden wasn't an uncommon name, but it connected to a thread I'd packed away with other childhood ghosts, the kind that smell like starch and brass and ocean metal. At 0900, a black sedan slid into the visitor lot, government tags catching a blade of sunlight. He stepped out with the posture of a man who had once walked through rooms and turned tides by raising one eyebrow. White hair, polished shoes, a faint limp he didn't apologize for. Age hadn't dulled him. It had distilled him. I met him at the entrance, returned his nod with a crisp salute. "General Hayden," I said, "welcome back to command." "Lieutenant Colonel Carter," he answered, voice like gravel under cloth. "Thank you." We moved down the quiet spine of the Hall of Honor, portraits looking on, like they remembered better versions of all of us. At the center waited the oak table, a fountain pen, and the blue leather logbook. The book always felt like a heart, thick pages that had soaked up decades of names, each one a pulse. I opened to the new page, set the pen in his hand, and stood at ease as he adjusted his glasses. His hand moved slow but practiced. He began to sign. A flourish, a measured line. The ink glistened. My lungs forgot how to work. Not because of the name he was writing, but because my eye landed one line above the blank, a signature already there. Clean, deliberate strokes. A slight upward tilt on the R, like optimism trapped in a letter. I hadn't seen that handwriting since 1991, the year a folded flag sat on our piano and silence moved into my mother's throat. Commander Daniel Carter, my father. Ink doesn't have a voice, but the shape of those letters shouted. A date sat beside it that didn't belong to the past. I felt the floor tilt. "Sir," I said, and my voice sounded like it belonged to a junior on her first day, not to me. "That's my father's signature." The pen paused midair. He didn't look at the page. He looked at me. A tremor crossed the distance between his fingers and the water glass. It tipped, slipped, shattered soft against the floor. He didn't flinch. "You shouldn't have seen that," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" I made my tone neutral and failed. "He's listed as MIA. Hayden pressed a thumb into the bridge of his nose like a man pushing back a headache that had been building for 30 years. He said nothing. The hum of the lights grew louder. A drop of water traced the table's edge and fell. "Sir," I said, steadier, "why is my father's name in our current logbook?" He breathed out like gravel pouring off a shovel. "Some things are left that way for a reason. 20 years of training is supposed to keep your face from telling on your heart." Mine cracked. I imagined the book closing like a trapdoor. I wanted to slam it shut and pretend I'd misread. I wanted to crawl inside it and never come out. Instead, I straightened. With respect, I deserve to know. He studied me, not as a superior officer, not even as a witness, but as a man measuring how much truth a person can carry without breaking. For a second, I thought he'd issue an order and end this. He didn't. "Come to my home at 1900, he said. "Bring no one." He placed the pen down with care, nodded once, and walked away. Steps deliberate, each one sounding like a door closing somewhere I couldn't see. The logbook stayed open like a wound. I traced the groove the ink had cut into the page with the ghost of a fingertip and felt the old ache strike new. The date beside my father's name was not just wrong, it was a message. The alarms going off inside me weren't sirens, they were bells. Back upstairs, Lieutenant Ames intercepted me with a stack of requisition forms. He was young enough to still look surprised by fluorescent lighting. "Ma'am? Everything okay?" His eyes flicked to the damp hem of my trouser leg. I'd knelt to pick up glass I hadn't broken. Fine, I said too quickly. He didn't move. You look off. Get your forms signed, Lieutenant, I said softer, and take your break somewhere without cameras. He blinked. Yes, ma'am. A beat. Ma'am, the visitor appointment this morning. There's no digital confirmation in the system. Admin entered it manually. He swallowed. I thought that was odd. Note it, I said, and let him go. The hair along my arms stirred. Manual entries could mean nothing. They could also mean someone wanted a ritual to look forgettable. The old records room lived 2 floors down and 10 years to the left, a bunker that smelled like dust and oil and the kind of paper that could start wars if you lit it right. The clerk on duty, a man who did crosswords in ink, looked up. Colonel Carter, what brings you to the graveyard? Following up on a Hall of Honor entry, I said. General Hayden's previous assignments, anything on Carter, Daniel, Naval Intelligence. He raised a brow. Most of this stuff is half blacked out. I can read between lines. He slid a cardboard box across the counter like he was handing me contraband. The stamp. Classified, D-Class pending, 2041. Inside, brittle folders, field memos, carbon copies you could bruise with a breath. One thin file sat like a match. Carter, D. The top sheet was a dead end. Subject transferred to Intelligence Review pending investigation. Status, MIA under review. No closure notice, no family correspondence. Just a date, August 14th, 1991. Underneath, I found a memo with a header that made my stomach lurch. Naval Intelligence Division, North Atlantic Command, Hayden's old department. The lines were truncated by black bars, but the shape of the story bled through. Procurement irregularities, internal review, pending recommendations sealed. I closed my eyes and saw my father's last morning. The porch swing, his hand on my shoulder, adjusting a too-big jacket from the base store. Always stand tall, Bear, he'd said, smiling in a way that made the world feel correctly measured, even when the world bends. He'd walked to the car. The taillights had turned the early fog red. After that, only the sound of my mother washing dishes for too long. I laid the pages out, made myself read them twice, then slid everything back into the box in the order I'd found them. When I rose, my knee cracked like a gunshot in the quiet. The clerk glanced up. Find your ghost? Just his shadow, I said. Outside the bunker, the hallway seemed to ripple with a low current I couldn't name. Maybe it was just my blood. Maybe it was the building. Routine had become theater. I could feel the stagehands moving behind the curtain. In the ladies' room, a stall door creaked and no one came out. When I stepped to the sink, the motion sensor lagged like it had to think about whether I was real. Back at my office, I pulled the visitor clearance log again. The appointment had been entered by admin with a pen and paper backup. No timestamp on the digital record. Retirees usually went through public affairs. Someone had sidestepped the light and made it look like a courtesy. I stared at the line until the text blurred. Ma'am? Ames again, hovering in the doorway like a question mark. We, got a call from a private residence in Chesapeake. Retired General Hayden's aide confirmed you're 1900. I know, I kept my eyes on the screen. Do you want a driver detailed? He offered. No. I looked up at him, and this time I let my face tell some truth. I want you to forget you asked me that, and I want you to take your break now. He hesitated. Yes, ma'am. He left, but not before glancing at the security camera in the corner, a flicker of understanding passing across his features. He's young, I thought. Let him keep his belief in clean lines a bit longer. At 1830, the base looked the way it always does, at the edge of shift change. Tired, efficient, honest. I signed out with routine hands and an unsteady pulse. In the parking structure, a sedan I didn't recognize sat 2 rows over, engine off, windows tinted. Maybe a spouse waiting for a sailor, maybe nothing. My key fob chirped too loud. I told myself not to look back and looked anyway. The highway to Chesapeake ran through pines that eat the sky. The sun bled down into amber behind me. My phone buzzed once, then stilled. Unknown number, no message. I drove without the radio, every mile the same sentence repeated in my head. My father signed that book. He signed it recently. He signed it because someone wanted me to see. Hayden's address sat on a bluff above the bay, a modest colonial with a porch light already awake. The house looked like Duty had lived there and never fully moved out. Tidy lawn, flagpole, a pair of deck chairs facing water as if waiting for news. I parked at the curb, turned my engine off, and listened to the ticking metal as it cooled. The tide made a sound like a long breath. I checked the street. Quiet. A neighbor's television flickered blue behind a curtain. A dog barked once and decided against it. I smoothed my uniform with a hand that wasn't as steady as I wanted it to be, walked to the door, and lifted my finger to the bell. Before I could press it, the door opened. Hayden stood there without his uniform, gray sweater, posture tilted by time. His eyes measured me, and then something gentler replaced the calculus. "Colonel," he said, "come in." I stepped across the threshold and felt the weight of 30 years come with me like a second shadow. Whatever waited inside would not give me back the clean edges of this morning. I knew that. I went anyway. The living room smelled faintly of bourbon and old paper, the scent of men who'd spent their lives keeping secrets and paying for them. Hayden motioned to a chair near the fireplace. The flames were low, but their light flickered across his lined face, softening the severity he'd worn like armor all day. "Sit, Colonel," he said. "I don't imagine you came here to discuss ceremonial procedures." "No, sir," I replied, lowering myself into the chair. "You told me I shouldn't have seen that signature. I'd like to understand why." He exhaled slowly, eyes fixed on the dying fire. "Because once you start digging into ghosts, they tend to dig back." He poured himself a glass of water, not bourbon this time, and took a measured sip before continuing. "Your father was the finest officer I ever commanded. He had something most of us lost, a conscience. He saw things he shouldn't have, things that made powerful men nervous." "What things?" I asked quietly. He hesitated, then looked at me. "Procurement contracts, faulty equipment being sent to allies. Men died because of it. He tried to report it, but there were names above him that wanted it buried. I was ordered to contain him." His mouth twisted. "Instead, I gave him time to disappear." I felt my chest tighten. "Disappear?" The word tasted foreign. "You're saying he didn't die?" Hayden nodded once. "He left. New identity. New life. It was the only way to keep him safe, and to keep the Navy from tearing itself apart." My pulse hammered. "That doesn't make sense. His file lists you as the reporting officer for his disappearance." "I filed it," he admitted quietly, "to protect him and you." The room felt smaller, the air too heavy to breathe. I stared at him. Then why his signature now? Why after 30 years? Hayden's eyes softened, the exhaustion in them older than both of us. "Because time's running out. He asked me to leave proof, so when you were ready, you'd find it." He stood slowly, his joints stiff, and crossed to a wooden chest near the window. From inside, he pulled a small envelope sealed with navy wax. "He told me to give this to you when I couldn't hide it any longer." I took it, my fingers trembling. My father's handwriting looped across the front. "For Theresa." Just seeing the letters made my throat close. "Sir," I managed, "why now? Why me?" "Because you still believe in the system," he said softly, "and someone has to remind it what honor looks like." The room seemed to hum with silence. When I finally looked up, Hayden was staring out the window toward the bay, his reflection a ghost in the glass. "Be careful with that letter," he said without turning around. "Truth has a way of asking for more than you think you owe." I nodded, tucked the envelope inside my jacket, and stood. "Thank you, sir." He gave a small, tired smile. "Don't thank me. Just understand. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't finding the truth. It's living with it." Outside, the night had fallen hard and cold. The water below his bluff reflected the moon like a fractured mirror. As I walked back to my car, I caught the faint sound of a door closing somewhere behind me. It didn't sound like Hayden's. I turned, but the porch light had already gone dark. I drove home in silence, one hand on the wheel, the other pressed over the envelope like it might vanish if I didn't guard it. Every mile back toward Virginia Beach felt longer than the last. When I finally reached my driveway, an unmarked sedan idled 2 houses down, headlights off. A man sat inside, face washed in the pale blue of a phone screen. I parked, waited. After a minute, the sedan pulled away. Maybe coincidence, maybe not. I sat in my car for a long time before going inside. The house was dark except for the kitchen light I'd forgotten to turn off that morning. The envelope lay heavy in my hand, the wax seal unbroken. My father's handwriting seemed to breathe. For Theresa. I set it on the counter beside the coffee maker and stared at it until my vision blurred. By morning, the envelope was still there, and so was the fear. I made coffee I didn't drink, watched the sky shift from navy to gray, then finally picked up my phone. One number glowed on the screen. Mom, she answered on the third ring. Teresa, it's early. Are you okay? I need to see you, I said. Now. Her voice softened. Come over. Her house hadn't changed in years. The same porch swing, the same rose bushes, the same wind chimes my father had hung before he disappeared. When she opened the door, she looked startled. Honey, what's wrong? I stepped inside, set the envelope on the kitchen counter. I need you to tell me the truth. Her eyes went to the wax seal, and the color drained from her face. Where did you get that? From General Hayden. She swayed slightly, gripping the back of a chair. He's still alive, she whispered. I nodded. He said Dad is too. Her hand went to her mouth, trembling. Teresa, if this is some kind of mistake. It's his handwriting, I said. I'd know it anywhere. She stared at the envelope, eyes glassy, and then sank into a chair, as if her bones had forgotten how to hold her up. He promised he'd never contact us again, she said hoarsely. He said it was safer that way. Safer from what? I asked. She looked down at her hands, fingers twisting together. From people who called themselves patriots but sold their souls for contracts and power. From men who'd rather kill a good officer than admit they were wrong. The words landed like stones. You knew, I whispered. I knew pieces, she admitted. Your father told me enough to understand he'd made enemies in high places. When he disappeared, a man in uniform came to the house. Not Hayden, someone else. He said if I wanted you safe, I should never ask questions. I stared at her, the woman who'd held our world together with silence. Why didn't you tell me? Because you were 9 years old and already looked too much like him. I thought the Navy would give you purpose, not reopen his wound. The anger I expected didn't come, only a hollow ache. Mom, I said quietly, I need to open it. She nodded, tears spilling over her lashes. Then open it. I broke the wax seal carefully, the sound small but final. Inside were 3 handwritten pages, the ink smudged in places, the strokes uneven. My father's voice lived in every line. Teresa, if you're reading this, it means I couldn't stay hidden forever. I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because love was the only way to protect you from what was coming. I refused to approve a shipment, faulty systems that would have killed men. Hayden helped me disappear before they could silence me. He took the disgrace so I could vanish. Don't hate him. He saved my life, and yours. If you want to find me, don't look in Washington. Look in Wilmington. There's a boat named Honor Tide. I'll be waiting until the sea takes me. My mother covered her mouth, sobbing softly. Wilmington, she whispered. That's where we honeymooned. I folded the letter gently, my fingers shaking. Then that's where I'm going. She reached out, grabbing my hand. Teresa, wait. After all these years, what if he's gone? Then I'll stand where he last stood, I said. I've waited long enough for ghosts. By afternoon, I was on the highway heading south. The world outside the windshield blurred into a streak of green and gold. The radio played static and old country songs my father used to hum along to. For the first time in decades, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like anticipation. When I reached Wilmington, the air smelled like salt and rust. The marina stretched ahead, wooden docks weathered and cracked, gulls screaming over masts. I walked past fishing boats and tourists with cameras until one name stopped me cold, Honor Tide. The boat was modest but clean, its hull freshly painted, ropes neatly coiled. Someone cared for it. I climbed aboard, heart pounding. Hello? I called. A man's voice answered from the cabin, rough but steady. Can I help you? He stepped into the sunlight. His beard was gray, his skin weathered, but the eyes, those were the same eyes that had looked down at me from a porch 3 decades ago. For a second, neither of us breathed. Dad, I whispered. He froze, the world shrinking between us to the space of a heartbeat. Teresa, he said, like the name itself gave him air again. I didn't run to him. I just stood there, staring, trying to merge the ghost I'd carried with the man in front of me. Finally, I stepped forward. You're alive. He nodded, eyes wet. Not proud of how, but yes. I read your letter, I said. Then you know enough, he replied softly. Enough to understand why. Not enough to understand why you let us think you were dead, I said. My voice cracked on the last word. He sighed, rubbing his face. Because the Navy wasn't the same Navy anymore. I had evidence. Proof that would have burned good men with the guilty. I thought disappearing would stop the cycle. I was wrong. The anger I'd carried all my life dissolved into something heavier. Grief, relief, disbelief, all tangled together. "You could have trusted me," I whispered. He smiled faintly. "I did. That's why I left. I knew you'd carry the name Carter with honor, even when they tried to stain it." The wind blew across the marina, carrying the smell of seaweed and diesel. I looked at him, older, smaller, but still steady, and felt the years collapse. "You said you'd be waiting until the sea took you," I murmured. He chuckled softly. "Guess the sea had other plans." I smiled through tears. So do I. That night, the tide rocked the boat beneath the stars. We talked until dawn, about Mom, about the years he'd missed, about the line between duty and love that neither of us had ever learned to walk straight. When the first light broke over the water, I realized the story I thought had ended 30 years ago had just begun again. Morning came thin and gold, painting bars of light across the cabin table where my father sat with a chipped mug of coffee. He watched me the way men at sea watch the horizon, patient and measuring. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "Some," I said, "enough to know this isn't a dream." He nodded, as if that answer was the only one a soldier could give. On the table lay a folder he must have kept close all these years, dog-eared, smudged, the kind of paper that remembers every hand that ever touched it. He slid it toward me. "You wanted why? Start there." Inside were photocopied test sheets, handwritten notes in a neat block script, a stapled chain of emails with subject lines that felt like stripped wire. Vexton systems. Navigation modules. Discrepancy flags raised by a Carter D. Internal testing results that didn't match the certification reports. At the bottom of one page, my father had written a line that felt like a verdict. "If this is fielded, men die." "Who else saw these?" I asked. "Hayden," he said, "and a handful of men who buried things for a living. He told me I was right. Then he told me to stop. I couldn't." I flipped to a grainy photo of a crate being loaded into the belly of a transport. A black arrow my father had drawn pointed to a serial number. "You think this is where it started?" "No," he said. "I think this is where it surfaced. Corruption rarely starts in daylight." He poured another coffee, offered it across. The smell cut through the brine and diesel. I wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic. "Why didn't you take it public?" He gave a quiet, humorless laugh. "Public with what? Half redactions and a whisper? The men signing those contracts had clean names and better lawyers. Hayden said he could buy me time to choose life over martyrdom. I took it. Then he carried the sin." "You trusted him," I said. "For a while," he answered. "I also watched guilt eat men whole. Guilt makes people unpredictable." "You think he could turn on me?" I said. "I think you should proceed as if anyone could," he said. "Even me." I looked up sharply. He held my gaze. The boat rocked gently. "You left us," I said, because the sentence still lived in my mouth like a stone. "I did," he said. "I don't ask forgiveness for that. I ask you to let the truth be bigger than my failure." We walked the deck in silence until the sun cleared the harbor cranes. A gull landed on the rail and stared at us like a nosy uncle. Somewhere near the lighthouse, a small knot of veterans gathered, trading stories in the ritual cadence of men who have survived more than they can explain. As we passed, one of them raised a hand. "Morning, sir," he called to my father. Marine cap faded to the color of memory. My father tipped his chin. "Morning." The Marine's eyes went to me. "You're his girl." I hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." "Fine man," he said. "Fixes our engines when they cough. Refuses to take a dime. Lucky to have him on the dock." "Lucky to have the dock," my father said. And the men laughed, small and warm. The Marine's grin softened into something like benediction. We moved on, but the sentence stayed with me. Fine man. The world had tried to write him as a ghost. The dock had written him back as a neighbor. At a small print shop near the waterfront, I scanned what he had, page by page, building a clean copy I could carry without risking his originals. The clerk barely looked up, absorbed in a tax form and a sports radio call-in show. When I paid, he said, "You in town for long?" "Long enough," I said. Back on the boat, my father sat on the bow reading a newspaper, a mug of coffee cooling beside him, the brass of his old insignia catching the sun on the crate where he kept it. He watched the gulls wheel and drop. "If you're going to do anything with those," he said, nodding toward my folder, "do it the right way." "The right way is slow," I said. "Slow is what makes it survive rain," he said. I didn't answer. I had spent my adult life making things airtight and palatable for oversight committees, but something inside me was done asking permission from men who had sold theirs. I'm going back to Norfolk, I said. I'll start with records procurement cannot refuse me. He folded the paper carefully. You will be tempted to set the room on fire just to watch the roaches run, he said. Don't. Light a candle and hold it steady. They hate that more. I know, I said. I wasn't sure I did. He reached under the bunk and withdrew another folder, thinner than the first. Inside, a single page. A receipt for replacement units dated August 12, 1991, 2 days before he disappeared. The authorization line bore a familiar name, Marcus J. Hayden. Cover or complicity, my father said. You decide. The highway home felt like a spool unwinding inside my chest, pine darkened into glass and steel. At the gate, the sentry saluted with a crispness that made my throat ache. In the archive office, the clerk blinked up at me like I'd stepped out of a rumor. Colonel Carter, he said, back so soon. I need procurement records from 91 to 93, I said, and a desk in the corner. He tilted his head. Those are restricted. Not to me, I said, and slid a signed clearance authorization across the counter. It bore the looping hand of a man who looked like a photograph now. Hayden had stamped it the day before. His eyebrows jumped. Yes, ma'am. He led me to a desk by a file cabinet with a drawer that liked to stick. If you need a dolly, yell, he said. I dove. The afternoon sank into a collage of paper cuts and eye strain. Most of it was mundane, the bureaucratic mulch of a machine made of forms. But one folder marked Vexton Systems glowed like an ember. I opened it to find internal memos with language so careful my skin prickled. Attached to a quarterly report was a receipt for replacement units, August 12, 1991. The same date, the same authorization. Hayden. My pulse stepped up. I flipped to the next sheet and found a routing slip with a handwritten note. Deliver to NID for expedited review. No signature. Next, a debrief summary with 2 lines redacted so hard the paper was thin. My father's name floated above the black like a survivor clinging to driftwood. I pressed my fingers into my temples and tried to think like the officer I kept on my sleeve. If Hayden authorized replacement units, he was either plugging a deadly hole or laundering a problem. If he routed the receipt to Naval Intelligence for expedited review, he was either creating a trail thick enough to survive later scrutiny or building a phony alibi for whatever came next. Either way, the date hurt. By the time the sun slid behind the base towers, I had made copies, logged a request for a limited internal audit, and drafted a training memo that would double as a fuse. I also printed one more document because it would burn a cleaner hole through any polite lie. Project Seance, 1991. Buried in the appendix, a memo from Vexton to a government liaison authorizing a controlled demonstration of modified navigation systems. The signature at the bottom was not Hayden's. Rear Admiral William D. Carver, current head of procurement, still active duty. I stared at the name until the letters arranged themselves into a threat. Carver had been my superior in briefings. He'd asked me about readiness, like a man asking about the weather from under an umbrella he'd already sold. I slid the memo into a separate folder and locked it in my safe. Outside, the corridor felt too quiet. The brass placards on the office doors reflected the pale sheen of fluorescent bulbs. When I turned the corner toward the south exit, I saw my own reflection in a dark window. Behind it, moving faintly, a shape. It could have been the cleaning crew. It could have been nothing. I kept walking. On the drive home, rain started, sharp at first, then steady. My wipers kept time with my breath. My phone buzzed with a single text from an unknown number. No words. A photo of the Hall of Honor, empty, the logbook closed. My hands tightened on the wheel. I sent the image to a clean device and kept driving. At midnight, I called my father using the secure protocol the Navy had paid too much for and used too little. When he answered, his voice was cautious. Honor tied. It's me, I said. I found things. Vexton, Carver, a receipt with Hayden's signature 2 days before you disappeared. Silence held long enough to let fear build. Then he sighed. If Carver's still in the room, you're playing on a tilted floor. I don't plan to slip, I said. You won't, he said. But men who live in tilted houses learn to make straight look wrong. Then I'll bring a level, I said. I could hear the marina behind him, the slack clink of lines against a mast. Teresa, he said quietly, you asked me this morning who I trusted. Trust your process. Don't let rage do your thinking. This isn't rage, I said, and was surprised to realize it wasn't. It's arithmetic. Good, he said. Arithmetic leaves a trail. The right people will follow it. When I hung up, I sat in the dark of my kitchen with the copy of Carver's memo under my palm and Hayden's authorization burning through my thoughts like a slow fuse. The clock ticked too loudly. Somewhere outside, a car door shut. I went to the window and saw nothing but my own face superimposed on rain. The next morning, I submitted the internal audit request through the most boring channel I could find, the one that wears a cardigan and brings cookies to meetings. Then I scheduled a heritage and ethics refresher in the Hall of Honor, a small press-adjacent training event that public affairs could not refuse and legal could bless with a declassified gloss. I included veterans and a Gold Star mother. I added one more name to the guest list by hand, retired General Marcus J. Hayden. By noon, my plan had shape, a ceremony no one could denounce without admitting what they were terrified to say, a packet to the Inspector General opening the door a crack, enough light to make roaches hate the room. All that remained was the thing I had been circling since morning. I took the folder with the August 12th receipt and the routing slips and the copy of Carver's signature. I placed them in a plain envelope, wrote a single word on the front, and underlined it once. Why? At dusk, the sky over Chesapeake turned the color of gunmetal polished by years of touch. Hayden's porch light was already on. The bay below threw back a dull reflection. I sat in my car, engine ticking, and counted to 30 because discipline has to start somewhere when courage is about to be asked to show up. Then I stepped out into the cooling air, envelope in hand, and walked to the door that opened the last time before I could knock. The door opened before I could lift my hand to knock. Hayden stood there, his face drawn tighter than before, eyes shadowed by something heavier than age. He didn't speak at first, just looked at the envelope in my hand, then stepped aside and motioned me in. The house smelled of cedar and salt air, but the bourbon scent from last time was gone. On the table beside a glass of water lay a single photograph, turned face down. "Colonel," he said quietly, "I wondered when you'd come." I closed the door behind me, the click louder than it should have been. "Yesterday you told me my father disappeared to protect him and the Navy." I held up the envelope. "Then why does your signature approve the same shipment he tried to stop?" He looked at me a long time before answering. "Because," he said finally, "that's what it took to keep him alive." "That looks like a cover-up," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Not protection." He nodded once. "Because it was. Just not the kind you think." He gestured toward the table, his movements slow, deliberate. "Sit. You deserve the truth. But when you have it, you won't rest easy." "I've lived 30 years without it," I said. "I can handle the cost." A flicker of something, respect, maybe sorrow, crossed his face. "That's exactly what your father said." He sat across from me, elbows on the table, hands clasped as if in prayer. The lamplight etched lines deep into his skin, every wrinkle a story. "Back in 1991, he began, "we were part of an intelligence review team. What started as a routine audit of Vexton systems turned into a hornet's nest. They had friends, senators, contractors, men inside the Navy itself. The moment we started asking questions, accidents began to happen." "Accidents?" "Helicopter failures, misplaced test shipments, one drowning that didn't make sense." His voice dropped. "Daniel found proof. Someone inside the Pentagon was approving shipments that didn't exist. Money was being siphoned into offshore accounts. Billions." He looked past me, into the dark corner of the room, where the old flag hung folded in a frame. When he confronted them, I warned him. He said, "Honor doesn't whisper, Marcus." That's the last thing he said to me before everything fell apart. The words hung between us, heavy as anchors. "What happened next?" I asked. "I was ordered to neutralize the problem," he said. "I refused, so they gave the order to someone else. That's when I knew the only way to save him was to make him disappear. We staged a helicopter incident during a classified transport. I signed the falsified report." He rubbed his temples. "I broke every rule I swore to uphold, but it saved his life." "So you were protecting him, and the Navy," I said quietly. He nodded. "Both. The truth would have burned the institution down." He agreed to vanish. I took the fall. The corruption continued under new names. I felt my stomach twist. So the rot stayed. "It always does," he murmured. But the men behind it are older now, some gone, some still pretending to serve the country they sold. I studied his face. Why tell me this now? Because they're watching again, he said. Someone reopened the Vexton files last week. That signature in the logbook, it wasn't nostalgia, Theresa. It was a warning. Someone inside command is digging where they shouldn't. I felt my pulse hammer. You think they'll come after him again? He shook his head. No, I think they'll come after you. The silence stretched. Outside, thunder murmured over the bay. He stood, went to a cabinet, and retrieved a small flash drive sealed in a labeled bag. This holds everything I have left. Emails, ledgers, names. I've hidden copies, but this is the master record. Keep it safe. If they find out you've spoken to me, deny everything. I took the drive carefully, the plastic cold against my palm. I'm not going to hide, sir. I've spent my life defending rules written by men who break them. That ends now. He smiled faintly, shaking his head. You sound just like him. Rain began tapping on the windows, slow and rhythmic. He crossed to the mantel, turned the face-down photograph upright. It was of him and my father in dress whites, laughing, young, unbroken. Dust had gathered on the glass. He wiped it away with the edge of his sleeve. We were young, he said softly, believed we could change the world. What changed? I asked. Time, he said, and fear. He turned back towards me, eyes glinting in the lamplight. Promise me something, Colonel. If you dig, finish what he started. Don't half die for it like I did. I slipped the flash drive into my jacket pocket. I'll finish it. He nodded, almost a bow. Then you'd better go. There are ears in these walls that don't belong to either of us. I hesitated at the door. If I need to reach him, use the name Honor tied in a secure transmission. He'll know it's you. I nodded. Thank you, sir. He gave a weary smile. Don't thank me, Theresa. Just remember, honor without wisdom is suicide. Outside, the storm had gathered strength. Rain fell hard, hammering against the porch roof. I pulled my coat tight and jogged to the car. When I looked back, Hayden was still standing in the doorway, framed in yellow light like a sentinel who'd outlived his post. The drive back was a tunnel of rain and lightning. The wipers could barely keep up. I kept replaying his words. They'll come after you. The thought should have frightened me, but all I felt was clarity, a kind of clean edge that comes when fear burns away. Back at base, the gates loomed silver in the storm. I flashed my ID, nodded to the sentry, and parked near the admin building. The rain slowed as I crossed the courtyard. The world smelled like metal and ozone. In my office, I locked the door, powered up my encrypted terminal, and plugged in the flash drive. Folders bloomed across the screen, scanned contracts, bank transfers, photos, internal memos, each one a nail in the coffin of some polished career. I scrolled until a name stopped me cold. Rear Admiral William D. Carver. He was there in black and white, procurement head, current, active duty. A memo from decades ago bore his digital signature beside Hayden's. Carver had authorized replacements for systems the Navy later classified as decommissioned due to failure, but the ledgers showed otherwise. Money still flowing, renamed, repackaged. My hands trembled as I printed the summary pages. I slid them into a folder and locked them in my safe. There were two paths now: expose them and destroy careers, maybe lives, or stay quiet and let history bury the truth again. But the word honor, on the boat, on the file, on my father's lips, left no doubt which path I'd take. At 0700, I filed an internal audit request under my security clearance, worded so bland it might put anyone to sleep. The clerk who received it didn't even look up. Official business, Colonel? Yes, I said. About time it became official. He stamped the form without realizing he'd just armed me. That afternoon, I scheduled a heritage and ethics ceremony in the Hall of Honor. A public event. Cameras prohibited, but press allowed. The perfect stage. I invited veterans, recruits, and one Gold Star mother. And at the top of the list, written in my own hand, Retired General Marcus J. Hayden. The storm outside eased into mist. My office light reflected against the window, and for a moment I caught my own reflection staring back, tired, resolute, carrying 3 decades of silence ready to break. Tomorrow I would stand where my father's name had been written, and I would speak it out loud. The morning of the ceremony dawned cool and pale, the kind of gray that carried its own silence. By noon, the Hall of Honor glowed under its hanging lights, flags standing sentinel along the walls. Rows of chairs faced the oak table at the center, the same table where my father's name had once appeared like a ghost on blue leather. The air held that old scent of polish and paper and pride. I arrived early. Habit. Control disguised as readiness. Legal had cleared the event as a heritage and ethics presentation. Public affairs filed it under community outreach. No one saw the fuse under the words. As I arranged the podium notes, I could feel the weight of every eye that would soon fill this room. Young recruits, veterans, a Gold Star mother with a flag pin on her lapel, reporters pretending to be uninterested. At precisely 1600 hours, the doors opened, and the sound of shuffling shoes and murmured greetings filled the hall. Lieutenant Ames approached, clipboard in hand. "Everything's on schedule, ma'am. General Hayden just arrived. Would you like him seated up front?" I looked toward the entrance. Hayden stood framed in the doorway, wearing a dark suit instead of a uniform, leaning on a cane, but still holding himself like command incarnate. His eyes met mine for half a second, then flicked toward the table and the logbook waiting there. "No," I said. "He'll know when it's his turn." The clock struck 1600. I took my place behind the podium and waited until the hum of voices faded, my palms pressed flat against the wood. "Good afternoon," I began. "Today's event is about two words we wear on our sleeves and sometimes forget in our bones: honor and truth." A few heads lifted. I kept my tone steady, formal at first, the way these ceremonies always began. "We gather to recognize service, to remind ourselves that the past we inherit carries the weight of our future decisions." I paused, watching the young faces in the back row, their uniforms still too crisp, their eyes not yet jaded. "Today," I continued, "we also correct an omission in our own record, a name left adrift in silence for 3 decades, a man who embodied the conscience we claim to defend." I reached for the folder on the table, opened it, and read the words I had written from my father's reconstructed file. "For integrity under pressure, for choosing duty to conscience over duty to convenience, we affirm and restore the honor of Commander Daniel Carter, United States Navy, declared missing in action, 1991. The room went still. Then, a murmur, confusion, surprise, recognition. At the edge of the aisle, Hayden shifted his weight, his expression unreadable. "This recognition," I said, "is not an accusation. It is acknowledgement. Sometimes history hides what truth refuses to forget." The applause started hesitantly, then gathered strength. I let the sound roll through me, steadying my breath. Then I did something not in the official plan. "There's someone else here who carries a part of this story," I said. "A man who made choices that broke rules but preserved lives. General Hayden, sir, would you join us?" Gasps rippled through the recruits. Hayden limped forward slowly, each step deliberate. When he reached the table, he placed one hand on the logbook as if asking permission from the ghosts inside it. He looked at me, then at the recruits, his voice rough but clear. "I failed many things," he said, "but I will not fail the truth twice." He took the pen. His hand trembled, but the signature came steady. Marcus J. Hayden, beneath my father's restored citation. He set the pen down and nodded once, more to the past than to anyone present. Then the doors at the side of the hall opened. 2 men in suits entered, moving with the confidence of those who had never been told no. Their badges read Defense Procurement Oversight. One of them smiled too easily, the other carried a slim folder. Behind them walked a third man whose face tightened the air around him. Rear Admiral William D. Carver. The Gold Star mother in the second row went pale. Carver's voice carried like a blade through the quiet. "Colonel Carter," he said, "you've arranged a touching display, but you're walking dangerously close to defamation." I met his gaze. "No names were mentioned, Admiral." "Yet," he replied. From the corner, my legal counsel, a calm woman whose expression could stop a storm, rose and handed him a single sheet of paper. "Inspector General acknowledgement," she said evenly. "Verification of declassified materials. Any attempt to suppress this proceeding will constitute interference with a lawful audit." Carver's jaw tightened as he read. "You're playing with fire, Colonel." "So were the men who shipped defective systems," I said. "Only they lit the match under other people's suns." A ripple of gasps moved through the crowd. Even the recruits in the back straightened. Carver stared at me, eyes narrowing, then turned on his heel and left, the suits scrambling after him. No arrests, no shouting. Just the echo of retreating steps and the sound of a door closing behind a man who had finally seen his reflection. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then I faced the room again. "We are not here to topple towers," I said. "We are here to straighten beams." A pause. The Gold Star mother lifted her chin. The recruits sat like statues, waiting. "There is one more person who should be here," I said. "But he cannot be, for reasons of security. He lives quietly now. He asked me to share only this. Honor isn't about being right. It's about staying true when it costs you." I turned the logbook toward the recruits, the leather shining under the light. "In this book are names of those who stood their ground. Add yours, by what you choose when nobody's watching." A young sailor in the back raised his hand, voice unsteady. "Ma'am," he said, "does honor mean forgiving?" I swallowed. "Sometimes," I said, "especially when the truth finally stands up." I turned toward Hayden. He met my gaze, tears catching the light. I lifted my hand in salute, not as subordinate to superior, but as soldier to soldier. He returned it, slow, precise, a gesture decades overdue. The room rose with us. Veterans, recruits, even the mother in the second row. One wave of hands, one moment that said, "We still believe." When the ceremony ended, people lingered. Reporters murmured questions about heritage and ethics. Legal collected the statements for the Inspector General. The recruits lined up to touch the logbook as if it were alive. Hayden waited until the hall was nearly empty. "Your father would have been proud," he said quietly. "I think he'd say the same to you," I replied. He shook his head. "I don't deserve that." "Maybe not then," I said, "but maybe today." He gave a weary smile, placed his palm on the leather cover, and whispered something I couldn't catch, a prayer or a goodbye. Then he turned and walked away, his cane tapping softly across the marble floor. The applause had faded. The flags hung still. For a long time I stood alone in that hall, surrounded by ghosts who finally had names again. Outside, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, lighting the bay with gold. And for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe without permission. 2 days after the ceremony, the base was unnervingly calm. Emails that usually arrived in waves trickled in at odd hours, and conversations in the cafeteria dipped to whispers whenever I passed. No one mentioned the event outright, but everyone felt it, like a shift in air pressure before a storm breaks. On paper, nothing had changed. But beneath the surface, everything had. The first news pieces were soft. Local headlines about restoring military integrity and heritage recognition ceremony honors forgotten hero. No scandal, no fire. Just the kind of quiet acknowledgement bureaucracies prefer when they're forced to tell the truth. That suited me fine. The less noise, the longer I could work before someone tried to shut it down. The Inspector General's office had already accepted the audit request. Their confirmation came in an email so brief it could have been mistaken for spam. Inquiry accepted. Further investigation pending. But I recognized what it meant. A crack of daylight through 30 years of stone. The following morning, I found a small white envelope on my desk. No return address. Just my name written in clean, deliberate handwriting. Inside, one line. Tell the truth, but let it heal. No threat, no accusation, just those 7 words. I knew that phrasing. It was my father's way of saying goodbye. That afternoon, I drove to my mother's house. She was on the porch watering her roses the same way she had every Sunday for as long as I could remember. When she saw me, she smiled, small, knowing. "I saw the news," she said. "They said your father's name out loud again." "They did," I said softly. I handed her a certified copy of the restored citation. She took it carefully, her hands trembling. "He'll sleep better," she whispered. "So will I." We sat together on the porch steps, watching the petals tremble under the breeze. For once, there was nothing left to hide between us. That evening, I drove south. The road to Wilmington felt shorter this time, the air lighter, as if the ghosts had grown tired of following. The marina shimmered under the setting sun, gulls cutting lazy arcs across the water. I spotted Honor Tide tied neatly to the dock, rocking gently against the pilings. My father sat on the bow, reading a newspaper, a mug of coffee beside him. When he saw me, he smiled. "Didn't think you'd come back so soon." "I had to," I said. "The investigation's official now." He folded the paper, nodding. "Then I guess the truth finally has its orders." "They won't name you publicly," I told him. "You'll stay protected." "Good," he said. "That's enough." We sat side by side, watching the water darken. A pair of dolphins surfaced in the distance, cutting smooth crescents through the bay before disappearing again. "Dad," I said quietly, Hayden didn't make it. He didn't ask how I knew. He just nodded once, eyes fixed on the horizon. He did what he was meant to do. We all did, in the end. I told him about the ceremony, the recruits, the applause, the mother who saluted through her tears, the admiral who left without a word. He listened without interrupting, his hand resting on the rail, knuckles pale from the sun. "Funny thing," he said after a while. "We spend our lives fighting enemies across oceans, but sometimes the real battle's across the hallway." "Maybe the ocean's easier," I said. He laughed, soft and warm. "You always were braver than me." "No," I said. "I just had your example." He turned to me then, eyes steady. "No," he said. "You had my mistakes. You just turned them into something better." The tide shifted, water tapping gently against the hull, a heartbeat made of waves. We sat like that a long time, two soldiers, two generations, two wars fought in the same name. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was full of forgiveness, of understanding, of everything we didn't have to say. As the sun bled into the horizon, he said, "I'm thinking of selling the boat." I looked at him, startled. "Why?" He smiled faintly. "Because it's time to stop running, and because I think it belongs in better hands." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small brass key, its surface worn smooth. One word was engraved on it, honor. He placed it in my palm. I didn't cry, not yet. Some tears wait until you're alone. On the drive back north, the radio played an old Sinatra song my mother used to hum while cooking. I did it my way. I laughed quietly, whispering to the windshield. We sure did. Weeks passed. The audit reports began to come through, slow, careful, official, each one another stitch in a wound that had been open for decades. Names surfaced. Some retired quietly, some faced inquiry, but none could pretend ignorance anymore. At the next command briefing, my CO asked if I had any closing remarks for the team. I looked around the table, young faces, hopeful, uncertain. "Just one," I said. "If you ever have to choose between your orders and your conscience, remember this. The uniform doesn't define your honor. You do." The room fell silent. Then one head nodded. Another followed. A few took notes. That was enough. That night, I uploaded the restored citation and the ceremony transcript to the base's Internal Heritage Archive. Under the comment section, I wrote one line. Truth doesn't expire. It waits for the right hands. Outside, the stars glittered over the harbor, reflected in the still water like scattered metals. I stood at the pier, the night wind cool against my face, and thought about all the people who had stood between right and wrong and chosen the harder road. My father, Hayden, maybe even myself. The sea was calm, dark, endless. Somewhere out there, a small boat rocked with the tide. Free, unafraid. I took a deep breath, pulled my coat tighter, and whispered into the wind. For every name they tried to erase, we remember. Then I turned, walked toward the lights of the base, and felt something I hadn't in years. Peace. To those listening now, maybe you've carried your own silence. Maybe there's a truth you've kept folded away, believing time would make it lighter. It doesn't. But sharing it, even late, can turn pain into purpose. If this story spoke to you, share it. Tell someone about the person who taught you what honor really means. Because the more we speak it, the less it fades. And if you still believe that truth and forgiveness matter in this world, stay with us. There are more stories to tell, more voices worth hearing, and more hearts ready to remember.